Welcome to tonight's event. This is the MPC Guest Authors Series, Reading and Discussion. Every semester, this series brings renowned writers of poetry and prose to the MPC campus for public readings and discussions like this one, and I'm glad to see you all here tonight. My name's Henry Marchand. I'm an English and creative writing instructor here at Monterey Peninsula College. It's my pleasure to coordinate this series. And before we get started, I would like to thank those who help us to make these events possible. Particularly, I want to thank the Humanities Division and the English Department here at MPC, and most especially Michelle Brock and Rosa Arroyo of the Humanities Division office. Also, I would like to thank the new Creative Writing Certificate program at MPC, which is a 15-credit, 5-course immersion in the various genres of creative writing, the study and practice thereof. It's available now for the first time here at Monterey Peninsula College. There's also the MPC Foundation, the Monterey County Weekly, and the Arts Council for Monterey County, who this year awarded a grant to the Guest Authors Series, which we greatly appreciate, and which has helped us to bring in 2 writers this semester, which we normally don't do. We usually have 1. But several weeks back, I see faces who were at the Amy Bender reading earlier this semester, and now tonight, of course, with Jane Smiley. That's a heck of a twofer, and I'm very grateful to everybody, including yourselves, for making these things possible and for attending them when we offer them. Before I introduce Jane Smiley, I wanted to say a few things about her and about her writing. On a personal basis, I've come to Monterey just 3 years ago myself. And of course, I knew Jane Smiley, and I had read 1,000 Acres, and I had read Moo. I'd gone to a university in the rural Midwest myself and was intrigued by an academic novel set in such a setting. And that was about it for my exposure to Jane Smiley until I came out here and realized, hey, she lives right here in the area and is the reigning preeminent literary figure of our area here in the early 21st century. I am currently reading a non-novel, 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel by Jane Smiley, in which one of the most accomplished novelists of our day explores and examines just what a novel is, what writing a novel entails, and what it is that makes a writer a novelist rather than becoming a poet or a short story writer or an essayist. I find that it's an inspiring and an enlightening book, which I may well be having students purchase for some of my creative writing classes in the near future. And not coincidentally, it's available for purchase tonight, right out there in the entryway of this very room. Several of Jane's books are available, not all of them, we couldn't fit them. But the MPC bookstore has several of Jane's books available for purchase, and I invite you to do so when the reading and discussion is completed. And if you would like to ask Jane to sign a copy for you, I imagine she would do so. That said, as a writer of fiction myself, a lifelong short story guy who's tried to tackle novels on several occasions and is only now confident that he's got one he's going to finish and it might be good enough to send out into the publishing world to see what happens. I've been thrilled in reading this book to learn of Jane's openness to different novelistic forms, almost a compulsion to write the kind of book she hasn't written before. And I went to one of our local used bookstores and checked their shelves and found the Jane Smiley collection. And there's a nice thick paperback called The Greenlanders, which is a historical novel set in, I don't want to get it wrong, is it 14th or 14th century Greenland? Try that on your piano, right? Okay, I'm going to write a historical novel. What historical period and place has nobody else dared to tackle? Greenland in the 14th century, okay. Anybody who's going to take on that kind of a challenge has my respect and my ear and my reader's eye. And I'm just delighted to be able to introduce Jane to you tonight, although I realize that for many of you she doesn't require an introduction because you're already familiar with her through her many fine works, or as many of them as you have personally read. So this being the case, we're going to have Jane Smiley reading from her fiction for us tonight, and then inviting your questions about her work in particular and writing novels in general. I anticipate some intriguing questions and enlightening answers. And without further ado, you don't need me talking anymore, given our guest of honor. Please join me in welcoming to Monterey Peninsula College the novelist Jane Smiley.
So in the last few years, I wrote an adult novel. I'm currently writing an adult novel, but it's not published yet, so I'm not reading from it. But I wrote this novel called Private Life, which is about a fairly normal woman born in 1878 who finds herself married to a real crackpot who becomes more and more of a crackpot as time goes on. So I'm going to read a little bit of that. But because we're here at MPC, I also wanted to read a little bit from the horse book series, which I started writing several years ago. There's been 3 of them published by now. First one was called The Georges and the Jewels. Second one was called A Good Horse. That's this one. And the third one was called True Blue. That came out in October. These are the only books I've ever written set around here. And you can sort of imagine them in a mythical landscape somewhere along Reservation Road. And they concern a young girl. She's 13 and 14 in the books that I've written so far. It takes place in the 1960s, mid-1960s. Her family have moved from Oklahoma to California, and they have a sort of import-export business. The dad goes back to Oklahoma, buys inexpensive horses, brings them to California, and sells them for more money here than he could get or could be gotten in Oklahoma. So I'm going to read from both of these. And I'm going to start with a section from A Good Horse. In this section, Abby has been to her first real horse show at Pebble Beach. You can imagine that. And now it's late at night, and they're coming home. As they come through the gate, the dad realizes that the neighbor's cattle have gotten through the fence up the hill and run down to their property and are standing between the 2 horse paddocks, the mare's paddock on one side and the gelding's paddock on the other side. And even though it's late at night, he knows that they have to get the cattle back up the hill. And the cattle are blue Brahmas. Maybe you've seen those. They're very active. There's a video on YouTube of a blue Brahma jumping a line of bicycles. They're good jumpers. We led the horses out of the barn. Daddy stepped onto Lester. Mom went to the mounting block to get on Lincoln. I climbed the gate of the gelding pasture. I did stop to pat Jack, who was snuffling in my jeans pocket. As soon as I was in the saddle, I could feel that Happy, that's the name of her horse, was happy. Almost before I settled myself, she was trotting toward the place where the cows and the calves had gathered in a group and were mooing and bawling. As soon as we got even a little close, though, the cows lifted their heads and started to walk around. Dad raised his hand, I stopped, and behind me, Mom stopped. We sat quietly while Daddy looked them all over, then counted them. 6 cows, 6 calves. Then he said, okay, the trick is to get them out from between the mare pasture and the gelding pasture, and then up the hill to the left, around the gelding pasture, and back to where they broke through the fence. He had some tools in his saddlebags, too, because he was going to have to fix the fence if he possibly could. That was 4 strands of barbed wire. Should have been 5. I can see that now, he said. Now, Sarah, honey, you just walk along there about 10 feet from the fence of the gelding pasture, and Abby, you walk along about 10 or 12 feet from your mom. Just walk. I don't want them moving fast. I'm going to go through the mare pasture and be there when they come out to the end of the fencing, and maybe they'll turn up the hill. He opened the small gate and went behind the mares who were gathered looking at the cows. There was another gate at the far end. He moved slowly. Sprinkles followed him for a few steps, then lost interest. We did it. Lincoln was perfect for this. He didn't seem to care about the cows. Walking along was fine by him. Happy, though, was a little eager. If there were cows, then you were meant to chase them, according to Happy. Her ears were pricked, and she was jigging underneath me, but she wasn't hard to handle. She seemed to know that Daddy and Lester were up to something. When they went into the mare pasture, she whinnied. Someone in the gelding pasture whinnied back to her. The cows stared at us. We could see their eyes and tongues shining in the moonlight, and they bawled and mooed, but they moved, all but one. And when she didn't move, Happy turned of her own accord and went toward her. The cow got going. She trotted over to the group and joined them. Her calf was right on her heels. I couldn't see Daddy, but I could hear him canter toward the far end of the mare pasture. I was sure that the cows could hear him too. Cows are as smart as horses and have plenty of opinions, but right then their opinion of Daddy was that he wasn't their business. Mom and I walked along. Mom started singing softly, "Riding old Paint, leading old Dan, gone to Montana for to throw the hula hand." I could tell she was feeling better. I said, "What's a hula hand?" "Sweetie, I have no idea." "There's feed in the coulee, there's water in the draw, their tails are all matted, their backs are all raw." Not these, of course. These live in the lap of luxury. I love their ears, and they have beautiful eyes. I said, loud though. We laughed. We walked very slowly, but now I could see that the first cow had come to the end of the fencing. Of the mares, Effie and Sunshine had walked along with us on the other side of the fence, just out of curiosity. And Jack, too, was trotting around as if the cows were his business like everything else. He's a yearling. He tossed his head and kicked up, then stood and snorted at them, his tail lifted and his ears pricked. The cows didn't even give him a look. Then I saw Daddy on Lester, standing like a statue just past the far gate of the mare pasture where the fence turned down toward the creek. We did not want the cows to go in that direction. As the first cow stepped out from between the two lines of fencing, Daddy stepped forward, but only 2 paces. The cow turned to avoid him, and her calf followed. The second cow was right behind the first one. I saw her stop and stare at Daddy, giving a big moo, and then the first stopped too. Daddy moved 1 step in their direction, careful not to get it all in front of them. They stood still, and then Lester tossed his head and snorted, and the 2 cows bunched together and turned a little more. It was then that they saw something, freedom maybe, up the hill, and they began to trot. Because the grass was so golden and there were no trees on the hillside, it was much easier to see the cows and the calves as dark shadows against the pale background. We could see Daddy, too. He turned Lester and walked him back and forth in a semicircle as if he were making a little wall, all by himself, that the cows could not pass through. But Mom and I, on Lincoln and Happy, just kept walking. It wasn't until all of the cows and their calves were out in the open that Daddy waved to us to pick it up, and then we trotted just as fast to keep up with the cows, but not fast enough to alarm them. Cow number 3 and cow number 4 turned a little further out onto the hillside than the first 2, but they did turn, and then they hurried to catch up with the first 2. Then right when I was remembering what a long day it had been and thinking how strange it was to be out here unhappy in the night, right when Mom was starting another song, sort of under her breath and to herself, "From this valley they say you are going," right then the cows took off, and they were fast. Daddy went after them, always trying to stay to the outside of them, and Happy took off too, with her head stretched forward like a dog after a bone. She meant it. She was so fast I had to grab the saddle horn to stay with her. Behind us, Lincoln was doing something because Mom stopped singing and went, "Oh!" But I didn't know what it was because I was too busy trying to stick with Happy. We galloped in a big arc up the hill, and the cows were tearing along in a curving bunch, Daddy and Lester just ahead of them. Daddy leaning forward in the saddle. He was good at this. I'd forgotten how good. He'd grown up herding cows, and it didn't matter that he didn't get much practice in California. He just did what he knew to do. At one point, the cows slowed down, and I thought they were going to stop. It was a steep hill. But they started bawling and running again, and Daddy kept pressing them from the side, and Mom and I kept pressing them from behind. When I got a chance to look back at her, she was holding the saddle horn, but she was keeping up. In fact, when one of the cows veered to the left, Lincoln went after it, and Mom stuck with him. We got most of the way up the hill. I could see the broken place in the fence against the hillside, and for a moment the cows were heading right for it. Then the curve of the group folded too far to the left, and just when I saw this, Daddy must have seen it too, because he cut up in front of me, between me and Mom and the cows, and galloped up the hill, pointing them toward the hole. It was easy to see what I needed to do. I needed to get up a little faster and keep everyone turning. The plan was that Mom would keep driving, and Daddy and I would make a kind of two-person chute at the gate, and the cows and calves would go through it. It worked fine until one of the calves ducked behind me and ran back down the hill. Since all the cows and all the calves were in a group, as far as we knew, they weren't our cows and we didn't know them personally, it was impossible to say why the calf broke away. The oldest of these calves was about 3 weeks old, so normally he wouldn't want to leave his mother. I saw Daddy on the hill pull up Lester and stare after the calf, then take off his hat the way he did when he didn't know what to do. The rest of the animals were still in a bunch, sort of heading toward the break in the fence. I was below Daddy on the hill, and just then he waved to me to keep doing what we were doing. Happy stared at those cows, and when the group bulged outward in our direction, she made a little jump toward them. The bulge disappeared, and then the group seemed to break up, and one of the cows burst out and ran down the hill. That would have been the calf's mom. At first, she didn't look like she knew where she was going, and she ran sort of toward Mom, but then she turned, saw the calf, and headed toward it. Mom and Lincoln stopped and then came on up the hill. Daddy got the others back into a bunch, but this part was a little scary. The gap in the fence was fairly small, which was good for repairs, but bad for getting the cows through. You didn't want the outside ones to either break down the fence or get turned back. We had to slow down but keep going and try to thread the needle. I could tell by the way Daddy was working at this that he had decided to think about the stray cow and calf later and just concentrate on the group. Then I saw the first cow go through the hole in the fence with her calf right on her heels. Daddy and I closed in on them, or rather Lester and Happy started being more firm in their instructions and moving toward the cows with their ears pricked and their attitude very intent. At one point, one of the calves must have brushed against some wire because it jumped away from the group and bawled, but Lester went for it and pushed it back into the group. Pretty soon, more than half of the group, maybe 5 or 6 animals, were through the hole. Then we heard Mom say, "Wow." Mom was still behind us, 50 feet down the hillside and coming up, but she had stopped and now waved down the hillside. Daddy was working the last of the cows, but I looked to where she was pointing. That dog, that stray dog we'd had around, was running up the hill straight for the calf and the cow. Just as I saw this, the cow started mooing like mad and backing up the hill. The dog went straight for her, and I was sure he was going to jump on her back like some wild animal or maybe grab the calf by the throat and kill it. But instead he lowered himself and seemed to slide toward the cow and the calf, head down and ears flat. By this time the cow had turned around and the calf was practically underneath it. The dog didn't bark or make any noise, and then he ran in and nipped the cow on the heel of one of its back hooves. Then he started running to and fro, below and behind the cow and calf, until the cow decided to move up the hill and the calf with her. Daddy still hadn't seen this. He had the cows in the pasture and was getting off Lester to try and fix the fence. He shouted, "Abby, Abby!" I cantered Happy up the hill. He said, "All you have to do is," I said, "look down the hill." Even from this high up, you could see the cow and the calf and the dog perfectly well. I could tell the last thing Daddy wanted to do was look down the hill. He sniffed, but then there they were, cow mooing and calf bawling, both of them running up the hill with the dog at their heels. Daddy whooped and then laughed, standing there holding Lester by the bridle. The dog was good. He didn't just drive them straight. If he had, he would have run them into the fence. but he knew that he had to get where Daddy and Lester were, and so he ran out to the right and got the cow to cross the hill. Daddy saw them coming and took Lester out of the way to the left of the gap, and that's where I stood too. It took a few minutes and my heart was beating, but it was like the dog never had any doubt about what was going to happen. He got the cow and the calf to where they were in front of the gap, and then the cow saw the other cows, and of course everyone was making an incredible racket, and then they ran through the gap and toward the others. By this time, Mom had reached me where I was sitting unhappy, and she was laughing. "Did you see that?" she said. And the dog, who had stopped and was staring at the group of cows, looked over at her. That was what made me laugh. I was the one who was supposed to guard the gap unhappy while Daddy fixed the fence, but I didn't have to. That dog sat down maybe 10 feet below the gap, right in the middle, just sat there with his tongue out of his mouth, a bit, but a confident look on his face, and believe me, those cows weren't going anywhere. When they moved more than he liked, he barked. So the dog, of course, they adopt the dog. Turns out to be a female, though. So I'm reading both from the kids' book and the adult book in order that we could talk a little later maybe about the difference between the two and how I've enjoyed writing both kinds for various reasons. This book, Private Life, ends up being located in California, but it begins by being located in central Missouri, not far from the Missouri River. And this part takes place in 1883. Margaret is young. She's 5, I think. And she has several siblings. And so I'm just going to start. There's a little opening scene, but then the main part of the book begins right here. For a while, they lived in town. She had a particular and vivid memory of that time. She was running, as it seemed she always did, back and forth from one end of town to the other. She was fast and gloried in it. She wasn't racing against anyone or getting into trouble. She was just running and looking at things. She ran fast enough so that she could feel her heavy blonde hair stream out behind her, subside across her back, stream out again. She passed one house after another. At the far end of town, there was a pleasant large house where some ladies lived, though they never talked to her, nor she to them. She remembered how one day she came to a halt in front of this house, and one of the ladies, a tall beauty, was standing on the porch, wearing an elegant white embroidered gown with a snowy eyelet skirt. Margaret stared at her, and the lady smiled. Margaret thought that she had never seen anything as beautiful as that dress in her life, which at the time seemed rather long. When the lady wafted back into the house, Margaret turned and pelted home, where she found her mother in the back parlor sewing. As soon as Margaret entered the room out of breath, she saw that her mother was sewing a copy of the dress that she had seen on the beautiful lady. She exclaimed, I saw that dress today." Then she went up and touched the eyelet. Her mother, Lavinia, didn't reprimand her, but finished the seam she was sewing and broke the thread between her teeth. Then she said, "Perhaps you did, but don't tell your father." It was years before Margaret realized that the pleasant house at the far end of town was a brothel, and that from time to time her mother sewed for the ladies to make a little extra money. In Margaret's mind, these dresses were always white. When she was older, though, and recalled this, Lavinia said that it hadn't happened. It couldn't have happened. Margaret must have read it in a book. What had happened, what Margaret should have remembered, was that her brother Lawrence, who would have been 13 then, had left the house with her one day and taken her to a public hanging. No one had stopped him because Lavinia was giving birth to Elizabeth, and her father, famous all over town as Dr. Mayfield — Margaret thought of him as Dr. Mayfield too, he was that imposing — was attending the birth. Lily, the housekeeper, was occupied with Beatrice, who was 2. It was said that Lawrence and Margaret left the house and were gone for hours before anyone noticed. But no one suspected that Lawrence, a studious boy, would have taken her to the hanging. Ben, yes, Ben was rowdy and adventuresome, though 2 years younger than Lawrence. The whole episode was a family legend, and part of the legend was that Margaret didn't remember a thing about it. Margaret looks on the bright side, said Lavinia, as well she should. From time to time, though, Margaret had a ghostly recollection of this bit or that bit, of her hand reaching up into Lawrence's hand, or of him giving her a bit of a crab apple, or of her bonnet hanging over her eyes so that she couldn't see anything except her feet. He might have sat her on his shoulders. He sometimes did that when she was very young. Nevertheless, it was a fugitive memory, however dramatic. Margaret remembered other things that she would have preferred to forget. She remembered that when Ben was 13, he went with some cronies down to the rail yards. They found a blasting cap, which one of the fellows attached to the end of a short length of iron rod that they had also found. Employing this rod, they rubbed the blasting cap against some brickwork to see what might happen. When it exploded, the rod flew out of the boy's hand and entered Ben's skull above the ear. He was killed instantly. None of the other boys was hurt, and they carried the body home as best they could. Dr. Mayfield met them at the door, and this was the first news they had of the death of Ben. That winter, Lawrence contracted measles, which led to an inflammation of the brain. The source of the original infection was what Lavinia had always feared, a child who was brought to see Dr. Mayfield. Elizabeth, Beatrice, and Margaret succumbed as well, but they were fairly young, and Lawrence was almost 16 at the time. They lived, and he did not. And then one evening, about 6 months after the death of Lawrence, for reasons of his own that Lavinia later said had to do with melancholic propensities, Dr. Mayfield retrieved Ben's rifle from the storeroom behind the kitchen and shot himself in his office. Lavinia found him. She had thought he was still out with a patient, but upon awakening very late, she heard the horse whinny out in the stable. She went to Dr. Mayfield's office to investigate and discovered the corpse. Margaret remembered that night, the sounds of running feet and doors slamming, the whinny of a horse and a shout either half rousing her or weaving into her slumber. What she remembered most clearly was that when she and her sisters got up in the morning, there was once again a large, closed coffin in the parlor. Their father was gone, and Lavinia, who had been sickly from so many pregnancies and so much grief, was a different person, one the girls had never known before. She was entirely dressed, her bed was made, and from that day forward she never complained again of the headache or anything else. Margaret was 8, Beatrice had just turned 6, Elizabeth was not quite 3. On the day after the funeral, which Margaret also remembered, Lavinia moved the girls to her father's farm. It was the practical thing to do, and Lavinia said that they were lucky to be able to do so. She told Margaret, because she was the oldest, that death was the most essential part of life and that they must make the best of it. Margaret always remembered that. Private life is based on, my grandfather was the youngest of 10 children. There were 4 sisters and 6 brothers. And there were so many children that that each of the older 4 sisters was put in charge of 1 or 2 of the brothers. And one of the sisters, I think she was number 2, she married the local genius from their small town in Missouri. And if you look him up now, still on the internet, he still has a following. But they'll say his name was Andrew Jefferson Jackson C. He was an astronomer. And if you look him up on the internet, you'll read 2 pages of a guy saying C was right, I made a machine according to C's principles. It was a genius machine. Unfortunately, when I went to the United States to show it to so-and-so, they took it away from me at the border, and now the CIA is using it, blah, blah, blah. So C was quite well known and is still well known as a guy who saw himself as Einstein's, greatest rival. He was the last Newtonian. He did not believe in relativity. He could not be convinced. And he lived so long and argued about it so long that he made himself a legend. Now, in our family, he was just Uncle Tom, who happened to be kind of a weirdo, big, tall, mustachioed, deep-voiced, sort of lumbering guy without a sense of humor. And in some sense, the family could not imagine how Aunt Frances could stand him. But I have to say, to give up the central Missouri for San Francisco, why not? Maybe the trade-off was just fine for her. She had a wonderful life. They lived in Vallejo and on Mare Island. So, women do it all the time. So one of the things that this book is about is, what is it like to be with you're a normal person. What is it like to be with a person who's crazy, and he's always like one step ahead of you? You think you figured him out, and he's over there doing yet again, one more thing. So that intrigued me, and the other books, I just got interested in stuff, I took Old English in college. I took it, and then I took Old Norse in graduate school, and I was in Iceland, and I knew that there had been a Scandinavian colony on the southern tip of Greenland. But I met a guy who was a sailor, and he said, if you fell out of the boat in Iceland, you would freeze to death in 30 seconds. And I thought, wow, that is so interesting that those people lived there for 450 years and then vanished, so that in about 1490, the Pope looked at his coffers and said, I wonder whatever happened to those Greenlanders. They used to give me a lot of money, Nobody knew. So now we know a little bit more. So for me, just being curious about things is enough. And I get interested and go for it.
You kind of know how it's going to end?
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. King Lear was the basis of 1,000 Acres, so I knew exactly how it was going to end. I just had to get there, But Moo and Horse Heaven, I didn't know how they were going to end. I hoped things would go well. These were some of the characters. But anyway, it's fun to know. It's fun to not know. If I haven't been there, I go there. So I did go to Greenland, and it really was interesting and fascinating. And I was thinking about it today. It's a very beautiful and strange place. And so if you look at this, nobody has a copy of the Greenlanders with them, but if you look at a copy, it has these faded out black and white pictures. And those were pictures that I took when I was in Greenland of the landscape. And I really wanted those in there so that, at least subliminally, the people who were reading it would get a feel of that landscape. It just really varies from work to work. Some forms are extremely strict in terms of plotting, like, say, Duplicate Keys was a murder mystery. And so you have to know exactly where you're going, even at the same time that you are fooling the reader, and the reader doesn't know where you're going. So that means you have to be quite well organized. 10 Days in the Hills, which you can only read if you're 21 or older. And I prefer 25 or older. That had a form which got its inspiration from the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. 10 people living together in the hills of around a big city, talking and trading stories at a point where their world is in crisis. And in this case, in our world, the big city was Los Angeles. The hills were Brentwood and Palisades and the Hollywood Hills. And the crisis was the Iraq War. So it didn't have a plot in the sense that, say, 1,000 Acres did, but it had a structure. Every day was the same length, even down to the word length. All the people got to speak up, and it had various themes that it touched on. Because Boccaccio wrote during the Black Death, I used a few themes like discussing Bergman's Seventh Seal in order to allude to Boccaccio. Because Boccaccio drew on stories from previous collections, I drew on Boccaccio and rewrote some of his stories. So I took one of his stories and made Henry Miller the character and had this happen to him in Paris. So those things are really fun to be able to do that for me. To be able to draw on old material and remake it. So even 10 Days in the Hills, which has no plot, had rules. And I think if you don't have rules, then you're just flailing around and putting off the fact that you're going to have to find a structure. Now, in 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, I write about what appear to be the rules. Novelists don't necessarily know when they're writing that there are rules. But in the chapter, I think, What is a Novel? I talk about strange coincidences. I read 130 novels in order to write that book, and it seemed like they all, no matter how long, they could be 100 pages long or 800 pages long, they had a certain rhythm. And so part of the rhythm was, at the end of the first 10%, we knew pretty much who the characters were and pretty much what the dilemma was. At the end of 90%, the climax had to be moving. Now, the oddest thing was, and this really struck me as odd, at about 62%, the author changes his or her approach. And the only thing I can, and this is right at sort of like the end of Act 3 in a 5-act play, or partway through Act 3 in or partway through Act 2 in a 3-act play. And the only thing I could come up with is maybe this is related to our natural sense of the golden mean. So there is a moment in every line where energy takes it in a different direction. That's the only thing I could come up with. I just happened to notice that. I thought, boy, this is really weird. And even when I went to the Tristram Shandy, which Lawrence Stern wrote in 8 sections over the course of 8 years, 62% it changes. He had no intention maybe of changing, but he had to do it. He had to do it. He had to take a breath and start it over in a different way. Well, I do think everyone can. I often say that the single requirement for writing a novel is the undying desire to write a novel. Because the people that I've known who've had this desire have done everything that it took, including changing their whole lives in order to write this novel. So say, one of the reasons for this is that the skills that it takes to write a novel, the skills in terms of literary style, the skills in terms of psychological understanding, the skills in terms of structuring, the skills in terms of intelligence and perception of thematic material. All those skills are not present in one person. There is no part of the brain that is like the musical part of a brain that just contains it all. That's why novelists mature late. That's why usually they don't, even if they start early like Dickens, they don't write a decent novel until their early 30s. They don't have to be almost executed by Dostoevsky in order to write a novel. They could just get a few bad reviews like Dickens. But usually when your 30s is about the time that you start integrating those parts of your brain that are fluent with those parts of your brain that are wise. So you have a theory, you have insights into psychology, you have a capacity for observation, and you have a certain fluency of verbal style, or you can get it. So, yes, anybody can write a novel, but they have to be willing to do it. They have to be willing to, sometimes they have to be willing to sacrifice everything in order to do it. Abby's books, as you can tell, are told in the first person, which gets rid of some of the problem. Because everybody remembers some point in their life that it was kind of, they are that person still, in a way. You know, maybe that person was 17, maybe that person was 5 for you. But for me, I sometimes think 14 is the age I remain. One of my former husbands, it was 11. He had a picture of himself. He was 11 when Elvis came on the scene. And he had a picture of himself pretending to play the guitar like Elvis. And he used to always say, that was the last time I was really happy. Then girls came along, right? So, but for me it was 14. I had a horse. I was tall and I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know the complications that were going to come from that. And I was learning to read books. I'd read some really interesting, good books in 8th and 9th grade. So there was something about being 14 that just sticks with me. And so since Abby is 13 or 14, I put myself in her mind, and I don't analyze it the way I would now. I analyze it as it's unfolding, I think, as I remember analyzing it as when I was 14 or 13. Well, thanks for coming.